Hey everyone, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video on the most common BMW S65 engine problems. So the BMW S65 is a 4.0-liter V8 engine that was found in the E90 and E92 BMW M3. These models are often referred to as the E9X for short. It was derived from its bigger brother, the BMW S85 5-liter V10 engine that was found in the E60 M5. Ultimately, the S65 and S85 are very unique BMW M engines. All other BMW M engines are based on some sort of production engine, even though there are a lot of changes made to the BMW M engines. For example, looking at the new ones in the case of, let's say, the BMW S58, that is loosely based on the BMW B58. Anyway, the S65 in the BMW M3 produces 414 horsepower, 295 foot-pounds of torque, and revs to a whopping 8,400 RPM. So a very impressive performance engine, especially for the time it came out, being able to achieve over 100 horsepower per liter. Very respectable power numbers for a naturally aspirated V8. A final note about the uniqueness of the S65 engine is the fact that the S65 was actually the only naturally aspirated V8 engine to power the BMW M3, and ever since then, M3 and M4 models have all used twin turbochargers. So ultimately, the S65 is the last naturally aspirated engine that you can find in an M3, and it was also the only V8 engine ever put into the BMW M3 as well. Anyway, with all that said, let's go ahead and jump in and discuss some of the most common problems with the BMW S65. Number one on the list, we have rod bearing issues. This is something that is largely blown out of proportion on the internet by a lot of different content out there. However, it is something to be aware of and something that's important to talk about because rod bearings are a known issue with the S65 V8. It doesn't affect a huge percentage of S65s. Ultimately, if that does happen, it's a very expensive repair and one that can often lead to complete engine failure and require a completely new engine for your M3. And so the fact this is such a severe issue makes sense as to why it's something that is so heavily talked about and discussed, and why to some extent it may be blown out of proportion a little bit on the internet. A lot of people recommend preventatively replacing the rod bearings on the S65 roughly every 60 to 80,000 miles. We think that's a little excessive to preventatively replace them just because that is a roughly $2,000 to $3,000 repair, unless you're DIYing it and have the ability to do a more advanced DIY like rod bearings. It's a labor-intensive job, and so that's why it often costs $2,000 to $3,000, if not even a bit more, depending on your location and what shop you end up going to, where you source the bearings from, etc. Ultimately, the best way to keep your eye on the rod bearings in the S65 is to do occasional oil samples and oil analysis. For example, Blackstone Laboratories does this. You can get one of their kits for free. They'll send you the kit in the mail. You can put a little sample of your oil in there. When you go do an oil change, mail it back to them with payment. I believe it's like $40 or $50 for an oil analysis. That oil analysis will tell you if there are any materials from the bearings and tell you if there could potentially be excessive rod bearing wear and debris or metal flakes in the oil. That can give you a good indication of where your S65 is at with rod bearing health and whether or not it is something that you should consider replacing in the near term, or if maybe everything looks great and it's something that you don't really have to worry about for hopefully a couple more years and another 10, 20,000 plus miles. Something to keep in mind, but not something that we would get overly concerned about or completely avoid the S65 because of it. Moving on to common problem number two, we have the throttle body actuators, or throttle actuators for short. The S65 V8 actually uses 8 individual throttle bodies, one for each cylinder. Then that ultimately requires a throttle body actuator, and so the S65 has 2 throttle body actuators, one on each cylinder bank, so each actuator controls those 4 throttle bodies on that cylinder bank. And ultimately, this is another very well known and understood issue with the BMW S65, and there are 2 ways in which the throttle actuators primarily fail. The first way is over time there's some plastic gears inside the throttle body actuators that simply wear down and eventually break with natural age and wear and tear. And the second way in which they fail is actually electronically. The circuit boards inside of the throttle body actuators are known to go bad. And so those are the two most common causes of failing throttle body actuators. Unfortunately, this is another one of those very expensive issues to fix. Each throttle body actuator tends to cost about $500 to about $750, and it is also a pretty labor-intensive job. If you're DIYing it and have some knowledge and skills, it's something you can generally knock out in about 5 or 6 hours, replacing a throttle body actuator. But ultimately, if you end up at a shop, you're going to be paying about $750 per actuator, as well as anywhere from another about $600 to $1,000+ in labor. And again, there are two of these, so if you run into failures of both, it can be a very expensive issue. And so another important one to understand before jumping in and purchasing an S65 is that this, alongside with the rod bearings, can be two costly issues. And unfortunately, it's one of those things, if you run into both of these problems, a throttle actuator issue, and then shortly thereafter run into problems with the rod bearings, it can be frustrating to shell out $3,000 for new rod bearings, and then suddenly a couple years later, or maybe even sooner, being stuck spending another $1,500, $2,000+ on the throttle actuators. So ultimately, those are really the two biggest issues with the S65. Moving on to a couple other things, the valve cover gasket, the idle control valve, and PCV system. Those are a few areas that tend to be a little bit more problematic than other areas on the BMW S65. Now, that being said, I did also want to talk a little bit about the S65 in general and some other problems that you may run into. We are talking about a high-performance, high-revving V8 here, and so in general, the S65 and the M3 are also going to be more expensive than your average vehicle just to maintain, even outside of any common problems. Things like brakes are going to be more expensive, oil changes are going to be more expensive. All of that kind of basic maintenance is going to be a bit more expensive on a high-performance, high-revving V8 engine. Outside of that, the one final point that I wanted to touch on is the fact that the S65 is now also in the ballpark of roughly 12 to 17 years old. So these engines are getting up there in age, and that does often bring alongside a number of age-related issues, things that weren't necessarily truly common problems or any sort of design flaws or issues with the engine. Instead, they're just components that are prone to natural wear and tear, and that's something that could be said about any engine of this age, not just the BMW S65, but just something to keep in mind there that other components like seals, gaskets, O-rings, plastic or rubber hoses, anything along those lines, those components that are rubber-like materials or plastic-like materials simply wear down with age and time, and sometimes mileage doesn't even play a big role in that. Age can be tough on some of these components in general, so something to keep in mind there, in addition to some of the common issues with the BMW S65, is that these things are starting to get a little bit older and are going to require a little bit of extra TLC due to that. Anyway, guys, that wraps up our video for today. If you appreciated the content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the description below for more. Thanks, everyone.